Well, good afternoon, folks, and welcome back to Three's In. Bobo is here. So this story took place on the 10th of December, 1981. I happened to have been down in Australia at that time on an exchange tour, but I've heard this story so many times, I almost feel as if I was in the squadron or maybe in the cockpit with them. At any rate, we have these two Fapes, Pat and Joe, great guys. And they were tasked to fly a weather ship that morning, mid-morning or so. And the mission was for them to take off, fly out to the area, get an appreciation for just how thick the cloud deck was, the overcast cloud deck was over Randolph, and get an idea if there were any areas out to the west or east that could be used for student training. So that's kind of what they were briefed for and were all about. So they did, and I never have asked them what the area was like, but anyway, be that as it may, they came back to Randolph, and they were going to shoot a couple approaches, as we often did, and then call it a day. So they're inbound on an approach, and it came the time to put the gear down. They put the gear down, and instead of getting 3 green, they got 1 green. One of the main gear was green, the other 2 lights were out. Well, crap. So they sat there and kind of looked at it for a minute, and we never would, in a case like that, we wouldn't put the gear back up. Just don't think we'd do that. Sometimes you create a problem worse than what you have. So that's what they were stuck with initially. And we do have an alternate gear extension system in the airplane. If you can think of a stirrup on a horse, it's kind of like that. The handle's kind of shaped like that. So Pat, being in the front seat, he reaches up and grabs the alternate gear extension handle, and he pulls it. And during the pull, he hears this snap. Well, crap. There is no snap in that. And I've pulled that handle, fair few number of times myself in student training and so forth. At any rate, Joe's flying the airplane, and Pat's sitting there with his handle in his hand. He goes, well, would you look at that? So he says, hey, Joe, he says, you're not going to like what you just see here. He holds his handle up, and the cable's dangling on it. And now Joe says, oh, crap. So they came on down final and notified Tower and the RSU and got everybody on the same channel and flew over the RSU and then by the Tower, and they all confirmed what Joe and Pat were seeing in the cockpit, that they only had 1 green light and the other 2 gear were indeed up. They didn't have a lot of gas to play with. They had a little bit, but not a lot of gas. So they decided to climb and head back out to the area near our bailout area and set up an orbit while they worked the problem. So they got hold of supervisor of flying, and who in turn got hold of Northrop engineers, and they began to look at all kinds of choices. They took the airplane through a series of G maneuvers, positive to negative, see if they could break that thing free. It didn't work. And eventually they got to the guy that designed the gear or was very intimate with the gear system in the 38, and he told them, you guys probably have the best you're going to have. I think at that time or sometime during this, they thought, what do we have to lose? They tried to raise the gear handle and put it back down, and it didn't do anything different. So now they're flying around. They've been talking to Northrop engineers, and they're getting down to where they don't have a great deal of gas left. Even if they had gotten the gear down, it would have been questionable whether they could have gotten back to land. So it became obvious they were going to have to give the jet back to Jane Fonda. So that being said, they set up for an ejection. And Joe, being in the back seat, he punched out first, followed shortly thereafter by Pat. Before Pat went out, he had that alternate gear handle. He put that in his flight suit. He thought he'd bring it with him as Exhibit A, I suppose. So they punch out, and like I indicated, there was an undercast deck that was really thick. So after the chutes deployed, they're sitting there, and Joe says, Bob, it was very quiet. So he's floating down, looking around. He says, I'm looking around. He says, I'm not seeing much, but what else am I going to do? And as he's coming down, he hears a helicopter It was one of the Army helicopters that had been contacted to come out to that area and look for him. And Joe said, "Oh God, I hope he's not under me when I break out of this cloud." Well, he wasn't. So anyway, they land, and that helicopter got on them pretty quick and picked them both up, and then took them back to the base and to the squadron. When they got back to the squadron, of course, everybody was just thrilled to death to see these two. And they took them over initially to the Randolph Air Force Base Clinic, which we used to call the Medical Hobby Center. They looked them all over, and they said, "Well, we don't see any injuries that are life-threatening, but we think you should go over to Wilford Hall." So they took them over to Wilford Hall. Now, when they got to Wilford Hall, this is getting, mid to late afternoon. They go over to Wilford Hall, and I suspect it was right around closing time for the folks at Wilford Hall. They hand them a stack of sheets and blankets and a pillow and tell them that they have to make their own beds. Well, you can just imagine. You've just punched out of a jet. You've gone through initial interview or whatever with interim safety board. Now you're sent over to Wilford Hall and told you have to make your own bed. We'll skip what I would say. Anyway, so they kind of handed the stuff back to somebody and said, "We're not going to do that, okay? Matter of fact, we're going to go look for something to eat." Well, they get to the cafeteria, and the cafeteria is closed. Oh, crap. So that's kind of the way their welcome to Wilford Hall went. Eventually, they found something to eat. They found their rooms, and the beds had been made, so they were good with putting on those cute little breezy gowns and hopping in and hanging out. Later that evening, some of the guys from the squadron showed up, led by Hollywood. I've talked about Hollywood before. Hollywood is Hollywood, nothing but the best. So Hollywood walks in, and he wasn't able to get a bouquet of flowers for him, but he figured a stalk of celery would work just as well. So he's got this stalk of celery in this nice vase, and what they couldn't see, there were a couple beers in the bottom of the vase. Anyway, he walks in and hands them the celery. So all is well. They spent the night there at Wilford Hall, and next day were released, and then eventually went home and got changed, cleaned up, and showed back up in the squadron. Everybody was thrilled to death to see these two. These two are just great guys. Anyway, they walk in the squadron, and one of the squadron mates who knew they had punched out of an airplane walks up and says, "Hey, Joe, you still going to be able to be our Santa this weekend for the Christmas party?" And Joe says, "What the hell?" Yeah, of course he was. But anyway, that was his big concern. And then the squadron commander, I don't think it was at this time, I think it was later on, as they started sifting through the wreckage, squadron commander, who was Lee Ellis, collared Joe and said, "Joe, why did you have a whiz wheel with you on that ride?" Does he always carry a whiz wheel, a navigational flight computer on local rides? And Joe got to thinking, he said, "Wait a minute. I had flown that airplane last weekend on a student weekend cross country," and he says, "That airplane was acting squirrely then. I guess just fate." At any rate, that's a short, condensed version of their bailout stories. They both were able to keep their seats. Pat got his right away and had his cleaned up, and Joe found his seat a couple months later a few months later, as the rain stopped and the ponds began to dry out. The seat had landed in a pond, and some rancher had seen it and called out the base, and so they went and retrieved it, and both of them have their seats in their respective houses. At any rate, that's a story of a successful ejection and survival, and two great guys that we're so happy to have with us today. At any rate, that's about all I think I have to say on this until Joe and Pat see this video, and then maybe making it over. So be it. So with that in mind, base gear stop.